certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
For the first time since the Claremont Serial Killings trial began, today, not a single member from the public is in the courtroom. Hello, good to have your company for week 16. I'm Natalie Bonjolo. Also joining us today for day 64, Tim Clark and forensic expert Brendan Chapman. Tim, I guess given the current health crisis, Justice Stephen Hall basically advised people today not to come unless they absolutely had to.
Yeah, that's right, Nat. We've been providing sort of daily updates as we've been going along, and there was a little sort of slight more strict, I suppose, measures put in place by Justice Hall today, which were on the lines of, if you don't need to come, please don't come. It's not a blanket ban as such on the public attending, but Justice Hall said, given that the measures nationally were made more strict last night, with now in Western Australia, as in all over Australia, gatherings of more than 2 people in any public place is basically banned. Then Justice Hall said, well, we have to sort of take that on board in the court as well. So the audio recordings of the hearings are now in place. So anyone wanting to hear the proceedings can go onto the WA Supreme Court website, register their interest into that, and they will be given a link. So you can now hear the court from wherever you are. Which is, as I've mentioned, unprecedented. That's never been done before, certainly in this state. And so, as you say, the upshot was that it was just selected members of the media, the interested parties and police in court today, and obviously the witnesses that we heard from.
Yeah, I still can't get my head around how much the world has changed in the last 16 weeks. I mean, this trial started with hundreds of people turning up, packing the public gallery, overflowing, spilling into second and third rooms. And now today, for the first time, not one single member of public. It must be so strange to be there now and to see how much it has changed.
It is actually. It's quite. It's been bizarre all the way along, with all the revelations and the interest, and now it's bizarre on the other end of the scale, in that we are still here and we are still carrying on, and Justice Hall is very determined to do that. But we now you feel a little bit like you're just in a bubble with just yourself and all the interested parties that you've been nodding heads and saying good morning to since November. But you now feel a little bit cut off from everything else that's going on the outside world. Obviously, you try and stay in touch as much as you can, but most of your day is spent in isolation, funnily enough, even though there are probably a dozen or so of us in court still. But we'll still keep trucking on, and we'll keep trying to bring the events and the coverage to the outside world as much as we can, which I personally believe is probably more important now, because otherwise you wouldn't hear it all.
Well, that's it, and it's certainly not a lack of interest. People are still emailing us and getting in touch with us. It's just literally the way the world has changed thanks to coronavirus.
Yeah, it is very. You're very aware of it in court, even though Justice Hall and both sides have still got a very, very important job to do.
All right, so today you had 2 witnesses, and both of them were forensic police officers. And what was the main thrust of their evidence today?
Yes, so this is Sergeants Siobhan O'Loughlin and Jade Sustek. They were both attached to the Special Crime Unit, or the Cold Case Homicide Squad, from 2009 or in 2009 onwards. And they were very experienced, specialised forensic officers on the physical evidence side of things. So their evidence almost exclusively surrounded Jane Rimmer's hair today and the role that they played in locating that, transporting that, and then ultimately very, very detailed examination of that hair mass, which happened over several days in 2009 and then some more days in 2010. And then there were other exhibits that both those officers were also involved in locating and transporting from place to place, but that was more continuity. So the main thrust of their evidence was how they were involved in the very important examination of Jane Rimmer's hair mass, which until they basically got their hands on it had sat in cold storage for 13 years after it was recovered from her post-mortem in 1996.
And were they asked in detail about the examination of the hair mass, how that actually happened, what kind of state it was in after being sitting in these freezers for all these years?
Yeah, very much so. So we did touch on that last week. Listeners might remember a couple of the officers who were also present, particularly one, George Patton, who was the scribe on that day or those days when it was being examined. But Sergeants O'Loughlin and Sustek were the actual people that were doing the examination. So that was very enlightening and interesting to hear how it was done today. And we saw, again, more pictures, in fact, of Jane's hair and how it presented after all those years in cold storage. The reasoning behind the way the examination was done, it was basically teased apart, the mass of hair, and then split into 5 separate sections so they could then really drill down into each examination. And that, and as I mentioned, it took 4 days in October 2009, and then the first section of that hair actually was again examined in 2010, and very significant pieces of trace evidence were found, and they are now the ones that the prosecution some of the ones that the prosecution will use to say there was a direct link between Jane's hair and Mr. Edwards.
Brendan, how does the examination of hair mass ordinarily happen? Is it a matter of, sifting through with tweezers and trying to see what you can extract?
Yeah, it's predominantly it is a visual-based assessment where you're essentially bringing whatever tools to the table that you can in order to try and identify what might be associated with or entwined within the hair. This is obviously excluding the analysis of the actual hair for DNA, but I think we talked last week a little bit about some tools we have, things such as polylights, which are these alternative light sources that we can use to try and kind of enhance contrast against the hair background. But other than that, it's really a matter of just using some really acute observation sort of tools with your eyes, I suppose, assisted by kind of low power microscopes or magnifying glasses to pretty much just systematically comb your way through that. And like any forensic sort of examination or forensic sort of search, we really want to ensure that once we've searched it, we can categorically say we've searched the entire area. So we use things like zigzag sort of patterns in how we might scan across the surface of the hair, same as we would on a large scale if we were searching a large area of land as well. So it's really just kind of scaling down what we do on a much larger scale at a crime scene or at in a bush environment.
And Tim, I understand that some of the photos, there were ice crystals still on the hair. Did that have to be removed, or did they talk about that?
Yeah, they did, Nat. So this was, I suppose, the longest we've ever actually been able to see part of either Kira or Jane on the screen, because, as listeners would remember, the very detailed evidence about post-mortems and crime scenes were done behind the screens for sensitivity reasons. So today, seeing all these photos of Jane's hair, it really did strike me how personal and how intimate those examinations must have been, particularly for two female officers, as experienced as they were. They were asked to do a very sensitive role in a couple of ways. Obviously very sensitive in terms of what they were trying to achieve, the detail that they had to do, the minute detail on a hair sample that one of the officers said was very brittle, very fragile because of how long it had been in that frozen environment, but sensitive also in terms of you are dealing with the hair of a young woman that was killed so callously and so brutally. So and those pictures really did bring it home. So that the hair had been in the bucket for 13 years. Sergeant Sustek said that was the first time she'd ever actually encountered an exhibit of that type, having been kept in a bucket like that for so long. And the mere fact that it had been kept in the bucket meant that the hair had taken up the shape of the bottom of the bucket. So it had to be first, as you said, Nat, the ice crystals had to be taken out, and then there was some hair and other matter that had adhered to those ice crystals. So they were placed in a yellow top container for further examination later on. Then the hair was taken out. It had to be thawed out and then dried, so it would be easier or possible actually to be examined in the way that it needed to be. So then it had to be placed on a piece of paper in a bag, then taken to a drying room at another police station where it was left for several days to dry out, and it had to be brought back very gently, and that is when the separation of the hair into manageable portions was done. That took a day in itself, and then the detailed examination of each of those portions of the hair were done over several more days. So, it's an extraordinary thing to think that all that experience was in that room for so many days, just to examine what was in effect one mass of hair. But we would now say, or the prosecutors certainly would now say, that was vitally important work, given what they say was found during those examinations.
Yeah, it must absolutely be a painstaking process in many ways, as you mentioned, Tim. And Brendan, Tim was mentioning how the witness said that the hair was brittle and it broke easily. Is that a common problem in this situation where the hair mass has been frozen?
Look, to be honest, the examination of a hair mass, like holus bolus, like that, isn't a hugely popular sort of exhibit to come across. So I can't speak firsthand about having experienced that, but I could kind of, when we do things like cross-section hair, as in when we want to try and cut a hair through its breadth, or width, sorry, we actually do freeze it to make it more amenable to shearing and kind of break through. So there's a couple of kind of guesses I could have around what might be the cause of that. One is, obviously, if the hair still is frozen in any way, then that's what's going to be kind of at play there, because there is a very small amount of water content in a hair shaft. So therefore, if it's frozen, that water will freeze, and therefore you kind of have this hair ice block, I suppose. But further to that, the whole process of freezing and thawing does have an effect on proteins and other kind of biomolecules that would make up a hair. So I could imagine that that freezing and thawing process could certainly denature or damage some of those proteins, which would lead to a hair being more brittle, I suppose.
So it's not, I mean, from what you've seen, it's not really a very common procedure that a mass would be kept like this and then gone through, in such great detail at a later date.
I've been to a few post-mortems where we certainly have retained a mass of hair. That's probably not so uncommon, but it's usually retained kind of as what I suppose a 1%er, or what if we need to go to this at a later stage, and usually we resolve the case, or we don't need to get to the point of having to examine that, and that can likely be returned with the body and given back to a family, I suppose. But obviously, in this instance, it is a 1%er, and it's come through with, I guess, the 1%.
Yeah. Tim, did the witnesses talk about, once they'd done their examination, what happened next?
Yes. So, and it was a very long examination in the first instance. Now, as I say, for over 4 days in October 2009, and then there were various instances after that they returned to the evidence and other pieces of evidence. But once again, this evidence was not scene setting, because obviously both the officers were actually doing the examination, but we didn't get to what they found as such. There were Sergeant O'Loughlin this afternoon said the examination in 2010 was very fruitful. She said there was significant amount of trace evidence found in that second look at the first area of hair, if you like, but this was the actual mechanics of it, and what it resulted in terms of forensic evidence. We are hoping to get to over the next couple of days. Yeah.
Was there any discussion about the conditions under which the hair was examined, what sort of room they were in, and those sorts of things?
Yeah, again, very closely looked at, and that was the main focus of the cross-examination that was done today. And it was given it was 2009 we're talking about now. Obviously, things at the Chem Centre and at Pathwest at that time had moved on technologically compared to the DNA evidence that we talked about for so long. And interestingly, one of the rooms that they did do the examination in was one of these pressurized rooms that we did, and we talked about a little bit, whereby it means that the air pressure, a little bit like on an aeroplane, or when you open the door, nothing can blow in, or nothing can be evacuated out either, because it was pressurized. So that is designed specifically to maintain the integrity of the environment that they were looking in, and the inevitable questions about personal protective equipment, PPE, were asked, and it was very obvious at that time that they were very aware of the potential of contamination, because it would appear that PPE was absolutely prevalent in all the examinations. In fact, Sergeant O'Loughlin let a little bit of a trade secret slip when she described wearing a bunny suit for one of the examinations. There were a few little eyebrows raised, but that wasn't. She quickly explained that wasn't in the Playboy sense. That was obviously what the examination scientists referred to when they talk about their coveralls, their throwaway blue suit coveralls that they're aware of wearing wherever they go in a forensic sense. And I'm sure, Brendan, you would have donned a bunny suit a couple of times in your crime scene experience, wouldn't you?
I certainly did, and I never really worked out why they're called a bunny suit, but bunny suit it is.
Would the way they are using protective gear be the same, or would that be even enhanced nowadays, Brendan? Beyond a bunny suit?
Look, good question. Not that I'm aware of, because with any sort of PPE, we're really trying to create a barrier, I suppose, between what the examiner is wearing and the exhibit. But we also do know that some of those bunny suits, for want of a better word, can actually come with their own fibres that can be transferred, I suppose. So the main thing is knowing. It's a little bit like DNA and DNA contamination. If you know the source, you can account for it. But if it's when you can't account for the source, so if you do have foreign fibres, for instance, appearing in a scene, and you can attribute it to a particular piece of PPE or a particular uniform or a particular type of clothing that was worn at the scene, then it's kind of not really a big issue if you can account for it. So it's much the same as DNA. If you can account for it, it's less of an issue. It's really when you get those kind of, we can't account for this, could it be, something that was legitimately left there at the time of the offence, or could it just be incidental?
I'm curious, at what point would a forensic examiner now put on their protective gear? Is it before they get in the car to drive to a scene or to the lab, or is it when they get to the lab? Because obviously we're talking about the idea that fibres from the car have been transferred into the examination room. So when do they put their gear on?
It kind of depends on what sort of gear you're talking about and where and what sort of a lab or environment you're talking about. But most modern labs, or even when you establish a scene out in the real world, you kind of have these donning and doffing or gowning up areas which are external to the actual crime scene or external to the lab, but close enough that you're not wearing it as you're traipsing through a busy office before you get into the lab. So there's no sure, fast answer on that. But, to use a lab scenario, you would pretty much be gowning up in the PPE immediately before entering the room, or within a small entry area to a room before the room. And you'll hear about a lot of this with the coronavirus sort of isolation rooms and things like that, where nurses and medical practitioners are doing exactly the same thing. They're walking into a first room and donning their PPE, and then they go into the second room. And there could be various stages there of, once you enter the room after the donning and doffing room, you may then put on another layer. It all depends on what the analysis is and what sort of or what the laboratory procedures are.
Yeah. On that, Tim, were the witnesses asked about the cars they drove and those kinds of things?
Yeah, they certainly were, Nat. The regulation question. And the answer is pretty simple. There was one car that the forensic team had access to, a Toyota Prado. So that seemed to cut off that line of questioning at the pass. But we will hear a lot more about cars this week, I've been told. Some of the later witnesses this week scheduled will delve very deeply into Mr. Edwards' car, which was seized, the actual car that he was driving in 1996 and 97, and police managed to locate that, and so that was seized on the same day that he was arrested. So my understanding is that the officer who did that seizure in December 2016 will be on the witness stand at some point this week.
Yeah.
And then there will be lots more about Holden's in general, and the car and the fibres that come from those Holdens, or the materials that were used in those Holdens at that time, and whether they were a match. So yes, we will hear a lot about cars in the coming days.
I guess just like the DNA evidence, as the trial progresses, the pieces of this jigsaw puzzle will start to fall together for us again. Brendan, we have a question for you from Alicia. With Jane's hair mass being frozen in a billy bucket, is there any chance of losing fibre evidence due to the drying out process?
Not that I'm aware of. And I think we talked a little bit about that last week, whereby once it's in the bucket and secured in the bucket, it will be there for as many years later as we come back to it. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of any fibres breaking down or disappearing during freezing.
Yeah. Tim, do you know what is coming up tomorrow?
Yes, so we should have some Chem Centre staff members tomorrow who were also involved in some of the examinations of the hair masses of both Jane and Kira. And then I understand we might hear tomorrow, but more probably on Wednesday, we will hear from James Robertson, who is a world-renowned expert in both fibre analysis and hair analysis, was running a very senior part of the Australian Federal Police in Canberra, and was the man who was at the forefront or the pinnacle of the investigation done by the AFP for those several years into the hairs. So that's what I understand that we have coming up in the next couple of days, which will be very interesting because it will be through Dr. Robertson, I think, that we will get to some of the actual results of what prosecutors say they found. And in Jane's case, that is more than 20 fibres that the prosecutors say were found over those various examinations in 2009, 2010, right through to 2012. And those fibres were both grey and blue, which sounds very simplistic now. I'm sure it'll get a lot more detail because the grey ones, as we've said, are said to come from that Commodore that Mr. Edwards drove, and the blue ones are said to come from the shorts that he was wearing, and pants that he was wearing as part of his work for Telstra. So that's the rest of the week mapped out, but who knows, Nat? It's an ever-changing scenario, as we all know.
And given the strict border controls now across the country, James Robertson, I suspect, will be a video link?
Very much so, unless he wants to have, well, he might well want 14 days quarantine on Rottnest Island or in a hotel, but I doubt very much that would aid the smooth running of the trial. So that will be video link. And then I've also been told that one of the Holden executives who will be given general evidence about Holden cars and the materials used at the time will actually be given his evidence from China. So I doubt that he'll be making the trip either. So yes, we will be travelling to various parts of the globe via the wonders of technology, but hopefully it'll all work and we can all keep going.
And were the witnesses today in person or video link?
No, so Sergeant Suspect and O'Loughlin were in person, in uniform, and were assured by Justice Hall that the witness box had been fumigated and cleaned in between appearances. So absolutely every single measure is being taken to make sure that no nasty virus might derail our trial here.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both so much. Thank you, Brendan. You're in self-isolation at home and Tim's in a semi-self-isolation in court. We'll be back tomorrow for day 65. That's with Tim Clark and Alison Fan. Join us then for Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Flashpoint, returning to 7 on Mondays at 9 p.m, demanding change and discussing issues that matter to West Australians.